Let's get right to it. After a weekend that really raised alarm bells in both Ukraine and Europe, of course, due to the U.S.'s controversial peace plan to end Russia's invasion, negotiations do appear to be moving forward.
The American and Ukrainian delegations say that they've hammered out a new 19-point plan, and this time Ukraine's president calls it the right approach. But it's also still a draft. Leaders of both countries will need to sign off, and then the plan has got to be pitched to Moscow. These negotiations come as Russia continues launching attacks against Ukraine. This morning, strikes targeted the energy infrastructure in Kyiv and killed at least 6 people. Water, electricity, and heat were knocked out in parts of the city.
Joining us this morning is News Nation's Jackie Capel. She has the very latest on negotiations this morning. Where do things stand as these negotiations continue?
Well, as you mentioned, they are continuing. Russia apparently is meeting with a U.S. representative, Driscoll, who is presenting effectively the plan that was created or revised with Ukraine's input and Europe's input. But not a lot of details are emerging, and that's in part in terms of the conversation with the Russians. And that's because these are such high-stakes conversations and negotiations, and no one wants them to, go off track.
And, the Europeans were so upset by this. They were vocally disturbed by this and are working on their own plan. What do we know about that?
Well, so it's quite different, right, from the original plan that was put forth, less than a week ago. One of the key differences has to do with Ukraine's territory, right? How much they have to, quote unquote, give up or not. It also has to do with how much army they can have, right? How many soldiers they can have in wartime, in peacetime. The initial proposal said 600,000. The Europeans have come out with theirs, which says 800,000. And it also has to do with security assurances, right? Security assurances arguably is the most important, according to a source I spoke to in Kyiv, the most important issue. Ukraine wants to make sure, and Europe, they want to make sure that Ukraine cannot be attacked in a year, 2 years, 5 years down the line by Russia to engage in another war like this. Because if past is precedent, then in fact, Russia will attack again. That's what's happened before, and what they want to do is make sure that doesn't happen again. Now, territorial gains, they certainly don't want to give up land, but that, I was told, on a scale of 1 to 10, security assurances are 11, and territory is a 10.
So as we mentioned, this all takes place as Russia continues to attack Ukraine. As you mentioned, attacks on the energy infrastructure in Kyiv. 10 people injured, 6 killed. President Zelensky says these attacks illustrate why allies need to stay on the side of Ukraine. He wrote, "This is precisely why all partners must remember that lives need to be saved every single day. Weapons and air defense systems are important, as is the sanctions pressure on the aggressor. There can be no pauses in that assistance. What matters most now is that all partners move toward diplomacy together through joint efforts. Pressure on Russia must deliver results." Is there an appetite in the U.S. for things like direct sanctions? Because we know some lawmakers, even within the president's own party, have been calling for that.
Absolutely. There's a huge appetite for it. And in fact, in the House, there's what's known as a discharge petition.
We've heard of those recently.
Yes, we've heard of those a lot. And amazingly enough, they're very rarely used in history. And in this Congress, they have been used more, I think, than any other time period or under Mike Johnson's leadership. And what it does is effectively forces a vote. And that means it's Brian Fitzpatrick, the representative, is the one who's calling for this, to force a vote, to force these Russian sanctions. In the Senate, it's very bipartisan as well. So in Congress, there's an enormous appetite to actually punish Russia further, because there's an understanding that Russia really is the aggressor here. They're the ones who invaded Ukraine, and that Ukraine really wasn't doing anything to warrant that. And so there is definitely an appetite for that. And it is sort of remarkable how bipartisan it is in this age of politicization.
And yet, I think 85 people sponsored in the Senate that sanctions bill, but that was like months ago, Jackie, and that hasn't moved.
It hasn't moved, and that's in large part because the administration, the Trump administration, has been negotiating, in effect, right? They've been trying to bring this war to a resolution, but as we've seen, right, the president has vacillated a bit in terms of who he sort of blames for the war, who he sort of blames for why peace hasn't been achieved yet. And even those mixed messages we're seeing this weekend, where he was critical of Ukraine's president, saying, that Volodymyr Zelensky was not, grateful enough, and then changed his tune and said, well, the deadline, Thursday's deadline for signing a peace deal is, malleable. So some of it is the Congress waiting for the president to act. but it does look like there is going to be some action.
Right. You mentioned the president's Thursday deadline. Not going to happen. Friedrich Merz, the chancellor of Germany, said, look, don't expect a breakthrough this week, chiefly in part because Vladimir Putin still has to come to the table. We know President Zelensky has said he is the only one that can sign off on any sort of land swap. Meanwhile, you've got folks like Don Bacon in the House really taking the White House to task over their stance in this 28-point plan. Let's listen to what he had to say.
He tends to blame Ukraine for Russia's invasion. I don't get it. And so I do not have confidence. The president has periodically said the right things, but more often than not seems to waver back into the Russian camp, the invader camp. That's why I think the House and the Senate need to take the lead here.
You know, Russia has called the EU deal, and I'm not ignoring what Bacon had to say, like that was pretty stunning coming from him, but he calls it completely unconstructive, and it just seems so obvious that if Russia sees it as just unconstructive, that gives them a lot of room to continue doing what they're doing, right? They just keep on engaging in this war.
Absolutely. And that's one of the, I mean, that's ultimately what people want to stop, right? They want to stop the war. They want to stop the Russian aggression from continuing. And that's why you have this, what's known as the coalition of the willing, which is all of these European countries, as well as Canada, coming together and saying we support Ukraine. Because even as recently as last night, Romanian airspace was infiltrated by a Russian drone and NATO fighter jets had to be mobilized. Right? Because Russia is just testing the boundaries, seeing how much they can push into other territory to see how much they can get away with. And what Europe is concerned about is that long term, Russia has eyes on parts of Europe as well as Ukraine.
And a lot of countries have been tested.
Yes.
A lot of them.
Which is why those NATO security guarantees are so important, especially to the Ukrainians.
Yes.
Jackie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you
Jackie.
next hour.